Chris inherits a chain of convenience stores from his beloved uncle. But when he goes undercover to learn the truth, he discovers a world of struggle, kindness, and secrets. What will he do when he uncovers the heartbreaking reality of his employees? Chris sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter in his hands. The envelope had arrived that morning, its formal font and heavy paper hinting at its importance. He already knew about his uncle's passing. His father had called him days ago to share the somber news. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. Life for Chris had settled into a predictable rhythm. A modest job, a small apartment, and the quiet solitude of someone who had long since stopped chasing grand dreams. Yet here he was, holding a letter that promised to upend everything. The return address caught his eye first: law offices of Henderson and Green. His heart skipped a beat. What could they possibly want with him? His uncle, his father's older brother, had been a towering figure in his childhood. Chris remembered the endless summers spent at his uncle's house, the sprawling backyard where he'd played hide-and-seek, the cozy convenience store where he'd helped stock shelves, and the countless stories his uncle told about life, business, and the value of kindness. Those memories were some of the brightest of his youth. But time had pulled them apart. Chris had moved to another state for work, and life had gotten busy. The occasional holiday card from his uncle had stopped coming years ago, and their connection faded into silence. The last time Chris had seen him was nearly a decade ago at a family reunion. Even then, his uncle had seemed distant, quieter than Chris remembered. He'd chalked it up to age, but now, holding this letter, he wondered if there had been more to it. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Mr. Christopher Miller, we regret to inform you that your uncle, Mr. Harold Miller, passed away on the 15th of this month. As his legal representatives, we are tasked with executing his last will and testament. You have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate, which includes the ownership and operation of 4 convenience stores located in the city of Greenfield. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of assets and any necessary legal proceedings. Sincerely, Margaret Henderson, Esquire." Chris read the letter twice, then a third time, his mind struggling to process the words. 4 convenience stores? He had no idea his uncle owned so many. The one he remembered from his childhood was small, warm, and familiar. A place where the bell above the door jingled cheerfully whenever someone entered. It had been a neighborhood staple, a place where everyone knew each other by name. But 4 stores? That was a business, a responsibility Chris wasn't sure he was ready for. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the letter pressing down on him. His uncle had left him this. Why? They hadn't spoken in years. Had his uncle thought of him all this time? The realization filled Chris with a mix of gratitude and guilt. He should have reached out. He should have stayed in touch. But there was no time for regrets now. His uncle had entrusted him with this legacy, and Chris wasn't about to let him down. He didn't know the first thing about running a business, let alone 4 of them, but he was determined to figure it out. He owed his uncle that much. The next morning, Chris called the law office and arranged a meeting. A week later, he was on a plane to Greenfield, the city where his uncle had lived and worked his entire life. As the plane descended, Chris felt a swirl of emotions. Sadness for the loss of his uncle, excitement for the new chapter ahead, and a deep, gnawing uncertainty. What would he find when he got there? What kind of business had his uncle built? And, more importantly, what kind of people had he left behind? Chris didn't have the answers, but he was determined to find them. He wouldn't just take over the stores. He would honor his uncle's memory by doing it right. But first, he needed to understand what he was stepping into, and that meant seeing things for himself. Not as the new owner, but as someone who could blend in, observe, and learn. By the time he checked into his hotel, Chris had a plan. He would visit one of the stores, but not as Christopher Miller, heir to the business. He would go as Logan, a temporary worker looking for a job. It was the only way to see the truth, to understand the business and the people who kept it running. The next morning, Chris stood outside one of the stores, his heart pounding. The sign above the door read Miller's Convenience, and for a moment, He was transported back to his childhood, standing beside his uncle as he greeted customers with a warm smile. But this store was different, larger, busier, and somehow colder. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, and Chris took a deep breath. It was time to get to work. The store was bustling when Chris walked in, the hum of activity immediately enveloping him. Shelves were stocked with colorful products, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a bright, almost clinical glow. Customers moved through the aisles, some chatting with employees, others focused on their shopping. Chris took it all in, his eyes scanning the scene as he adjusted the name tag pinned to his shirt. Logan, cleaning staff. He had spent the morning filling out paperwork and meeting the store manager, a brisk woman in her late 40s named Linda. She had barely looked at him when assigning his tasks, her attention divided between her clipboard and the constant stream of questions from employees. Chris didn't mind. The less attention he drew, the better. His goal was to observe, to understand the inner workings of the store and the people who kept it running. His first task was simple: restock the shelves in the snack aisle. As he worked, he kept his ears open, listening to the conversations around him. Employees greeted customers by name, exchanged small talk, and occasionally shared a laugh. It was clear that, despite the store's size, it still had the feel of a neighborhood hub. But there was something else too: a tension, a weariness that lingered beneath the surface. Chris couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was there, like a faint hum in the background. It wasn't long before he noticed Samuel. Samuel was hard to miss. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and a warm, approachable demeanor. He moved through the store with a sense of purpose, always smiling, always ready to help. Chris watched as Samuel assisted an elderly woman with her groceries, patiently explaining a promotion on canned goods, and then carrying her bags to her car. Later, he saw Samuel quietly slip a few dollars to a young mother who was short on cash at the register. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Chris felt a pang of admiration. Samuel wasn't just doing his job. He was going above and beyond, treating the store and its customers as if they were his own. But there was something else too: a sadness in Samuel's eyes, a weight that seemed to pull at him even as he smiled. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Samuel's story. Over the next few days, Chris kept a close eye on Samuel, learning more about him through observation and snippets of conversation. Samuel was a jack of all trades at the store, working the register, stocking shelves, and even helping with maintenance when needed. He was well liked by both customers and co-workers, his presence a calming force in the busy environment. But Chris also noticed the small signs of struggle: the worn edges of Samuel's uniform, the way he hesitated before buying his own lunch, the occasional worried glances at his phone. One afternoon, Chris overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. He was in the back room, organizing cleaning supplies, when Samuel's voice drifted in from the hallway. I know, Samuel was saying, his tone low and strained, but I just need a little more time. The school fees are due next week, and I'm doing everything I can. I'll figure it out, I promise. There was a pause, and then Samuel sighed. I miss her too, buddy, every day. But we'll get through this, okay? We'll make her proud. Chris's heart ached as he listened. It was clear that Samuel was talking to his son, and the conversation painted a picture of a man doing his best to hold things together. The mention of school fees and the reference to someone they missed, Chris assumed it was Samuel's late wife, added layers to the story. Samuel wasn't just struggling. He was carrying the weight of his family's future on his shoulders. Later that day, Chris saw Samuel in the break room, sitting alone with a cup of coffee. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped as he stared at the table. Chris hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down across from him. Long day? Chris asked, keeping his tone casual. Samuel looked up, surprised, but then smiled faintly. You could say that. Just one of those days where everything feels a little heavier, you know? Chris nodded. I get that. This place seems like a lot to keep up with. Samuel chuckled softly. It is, but it's home in a way. I've been here for years, seen a lot of changes, good and bad. Chris leaned forward slightly, careful not to push too hard. Sounds like you really care about this place. Samuel's expression softened. I do. Mr. Miller, the owner, he was a good man. He built this store from the ground up, always treated us like family. But lately, he trailed off, shaking his head. Things have been different. Harder. Chris felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but he knew he had to be careful. He was still Logan, the new guy, and he couldn't risk revealing too much. Instead, he simply said, well, for what it's worth, you make a difference here. I've seen it. Samuel looked at him, his eyes searching Chris's face for a moment. Then he smiled, a genuine, grateful smile. Thank you. That means a lot. As Chris left the break room, his mind was racing. Samuel was the heart of the store, a man who gave everything he had to help others, even when he was struggling himself. Chris couldn't ignore what he'd seen and heard. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to do something about it. Samuel deserved better, and so did everyone else who worked here. But first, Chris needed to learn more. He needed to understand the full story, not just about Samuel, but about the store, the employees, and the legacy his uncle had left behind. Only then could he figure out how to honor that legacy and make a real difference. For now, he would keep watching, keep listening, and keep learning. Chris had been working at the store for over a week now, blending in seamlessly as Logan, the new cleaner. He had observed Samuel closely, noting the man's unwavering kindness and the quiet sacrifices he made every day. It was during one of these moments that Chris felt the weight of his own deception pressing down on him. He couldn't keep up the charade any longer, not after what he had just witnessed. It was mid-afternoon, and the store was relatively quiet. Chris was restocking shelves near the front when he saw Samuel at the register, helping an elderly man who was counting out coins with trembling hands. The man was short a few dollars, and Chris watched as Samuel quietly pulled out his own wallet and covered the difference. The man thanked him profusely, but Samuel just smiled and waved it off, as if it were nothing. A few minutes later, Chris saw Samuel again, this time in the break room. A homeless man had wandered into the store, and Samuel was handing him a sandwich from his own lunch. Here you go, Samuel said, his voice warm and gentle. It's not much, but it'll help. Chris felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen Samuel's struggles, the worn-out shoes, the hesitation before buying his own lunch, the worried glances at his phone when he thought no one was looking. And yet, despite his own hardships, Samuel continued to give, to help, to care. It was a level of selflessness that Chris couldn't ignore. That evening, as the store was closing, Chris approached Samuel in the stockroom. Samuel was organizing some boxes, his back turned, but he looked up when he heard Chris enter. Hey, Logan, Samuel said, smiling. Need something? Chris took a deep breath. Actually, I need to talk to you about something important. Samuel's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. Is everything okay? Chris nodded. Yeah, but there's something you should know. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I haven't been entirely honest with you. My name isn't Logan. It's Chris. Chris Miller. Samuel's brow furrowed. Chris Miller? As in, Harold Miller's nephew. Chris nodded again. Yes, my uncle left me the stores in his will. I've been working here undercover to understand what's really going on. I wanted to see things for myself before making any decisions. Samuel stared at him, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. You're the new owner? I am, Chris said. And after what I've seen, what I've learned, I know things need to change. Starting with you. Samuel shook his head, still processing the revelation. I don't understand. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the heart of this store, Chris said firmly. I've seen how much you do for the customers, for your coworkers, for this community. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Chris said. I'm going to make this store what it should be, a place where people feel valued and supported. These stores are my uncle's legacy, and I'm not going to let it die, but I can't do it alone. I need people like you, who care about this place as much as I do. Samuel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally looked up, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. As they stood there, the weight of the past and the promise of the future hanging in the air, Chris felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had revealed the truth, and now it was time to act. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. There were challenges ahead: resistance from Linda, skepticism from the employees, and the daunting task of rebuilding what had been lost. But Chris felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The journey was just beginning. The days following Chris's revelation to Samuel were a whirlwind of emotions and quiet observations. Samuel kept Chris's secret, but the weight of the truth seemed to lift some of the burden from his shoulders. Chris noticed a subtle change in Samuel, a little more spring in his step, a little more hope in his eyes. It was a small victory, but it gave Chris the confidence to dig deeper. One evening, after the store had closed and the employees had gone home, Chris asked Samuel to stay behind. The two men sat in the break room, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the otherwise silent store. Chris had brought coffee, and they sat across from each other, the steam from their cups curling into the air. "I need to understand what happened here," Chris said, breaking the silence. "My uncle, what was he like before he got sick? What changed?" Samuel sighed, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "Your uncle was different, in a good way. He cared about this store, about the people who worked here. He knew everyone's name, their stories. He'd sit right here, in this break room, and ask about our families, our dreams. It wasn't just a job to him." Chris nodded, his chest tightening at the image of his uncle, the man he remembered from his childhood, full of life and laughter. "What happened?" Samuel's expression darkened. "He got sick. Started slowly, he'd come in less often, spend more time at home. At first, we thought it was just age catching up to him. But then it got worse. He stopped coming altogether and Linda took over. She's not a bad person, but she doesn't see the store the way he did. To her, it's about numbers, efficiency. She cut hours, tightened budgets, and stopped listening to us. It felt like the soul of this place was being stripped away." Chris leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "And no one said anything?" Samuel shrugged. "What could we say? Your uncle wasn't here to defend us, and Linda had the authority. We just tried to keep things running, to hold on to what we could. But it's been really hard." Chris felt a surge of guilt. If he had known, if he had been there, maybe things would have been different. But he couldn't change the past. All he could do was try to make things right now. "What about you?" Chris asked gently. "You've been carrying a lot. I heard you talking to your son the other day. About school fees." Samuel looked down, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, it's been tough. My wife passed away a few months ago, and it's just been me and my son since then. He's a good kid, smart, hardworking. But school is expensive and my salary here, it's not enough. I've been picking up extra shifts wherever I can, but it's never enough." Chris's heart ached for Samuel. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "Why didn't you say something? To Linda, or to anyone?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "And risk losing my job? I can't afford to be without work, not even for a day. I've seen what happens to people who speak up. They get labeled as troublemakers and suddenly their hours are cut, or they're let go altogether. I couldn't take that risk, not with my son depending on me." Chris clenched his fists under the table, his frustration bubbling to the surface. This wasn't what his uncle would have wanted. This wasn't the kind of business he had built. Chris had to fix this, for Samuel and everyone who worked here. "Samuel," Chris said, his voice firm, "I'm going to make this right, starting with you. I'm going to cover your son's school fees, and I'm going to make sure you're paid what you're worth. But I need your help. I need to know everything, what's working, what's not, and how we can make this store what it used to be." Samuel was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You have no idea what this means to me. Chris reached across the table and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. We're going to fix this. Together. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. Chris, now fully stepping into his role as the owner, began to implement the first of many reforms. He started with Samuel, ensuring his son's school fees were covered and adjusting his salary to reflect his value to the store. But Chris knew that one act of kindness, while important, wasn't enough. He needed to address the systemic issues that had been plaguing the store for months. His first official act as owner was to call a meeting with all the employees. The break room was packed, the air thick with curiosity and apprehension. Chris stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. He had spent days preparing for this moment, rehearsing what he would say, but now that it was here, he decided to speak from the heart. "Thank you all for being here," Chris began, his voice calm but firm. "I know there's been a lot of uncertainty lately, and I want to start by saying this. I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, and I'm here to make things right." He paused, letting his words sink in. The employees exchanged glances, some skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. "My uncle, Harold Miller, built this store and the others with a simple philosophy, that a business is only as strong as the people who run it. He believed in treating everyone with respect, in creating a place where people felt valued and supported. Over the last few months, that philosophy has been lost, and for that, I take responsibility." Chris looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "But today we start over. Today we rebuild. And I need your help to do it." He outlined his plans: fair wages, better benefits, more flexible schedules, and opportunities for advancement. He talked about creating a fund to support employees in times of need, like Samuel's situation. He promised to be present, to listen, and to make decisions with the employees' best interests in mind. The room was silent when he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It was Samuel, his eyes shining with pride. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the room. Chris felt a lump in his throat. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Chris worked tirelessly to turn his promises into reality. He met with each employee individually, listening to their concerns and ideas. He spent hours reviewing the store's finances, finding ways to cut unnecessary costs without sacrificing quality or employee well-being. He even reached out to local schools and community organizations, forging partnerships that would benefit both the store and the neighborhood. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of an employee council, a group of staff members who would meet regularly with Chris to discuss issues and propose solutions. Samuel was the first to volunteer, and his insights proved invaluable. Together, they tackled everything from scheduling conflicts to inventory management, always with an eye toward fairness and efficiency. But not everyone was on board. Linda, the store manager, resisted the changes at every turn. She had grown accustomed to running the store her way, and the idea of sharing power didn't sit well with her. Chris tried to reason with her, to explain that these changes were for the good of the store and its employees, but she remained stubborn. One afternoon, Chris called Linda into his office. The tension between them was palpable, but Chris remained calm. "Linda, I know this hasn't been easy for you," he said, "but I need to know, are you with us? Are you willing to work together to make this store what it can be?" Linda crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "I've been running this store for years. I know what works and what doesn't. These changes are going to ruin everything." Chris shook his head. "They're not changes for the sake of change. They're changes to honor my uncle's vision, to create a place where people feel valued and supported. If that's not something you can get behind, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." Linda stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for me to move on." Chris nodded, his heart heavy but his resolve unwavering. "I'll help you with the transition, and I want you to know, I appreciate everything you've done for this store. But it's time for a new chapter." With Linda's departure, Chris promoted Samuel to store manager. It was a decision that was met with unanimous approval from the employees, and Samuel took to the role with a quiet determination. Under his leadership, the store began to thrive. The atmosphere shifted, the tension replaced by a sense of camaraderie and purpose. Customers noticed the difference too, commenting on the improved service and the warm, welcoming environment. Chris made it a point to visit the store regularly, not as the owner, but as a member of the team. He stocked shelves, worked the register, and even mopped floors alongside the employees. It was his way of staying connected, of reminding himself why he was doing this. One evening, as the store was closing, Chris found Samuel in the break room, looking over the day's sales report. "How's it looking?" Chris asked, leaning against the doorframe. Samuel looked up and smiled. "Better than ever. Sales are up and the employees, they're happy. It's like a different place." Chris nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "It's what my uncle would have wanted." Samuel's expression softened. "He'd be proud of you, you know. You've done more than just save this store. You've given it a new life." Chris felt a lump in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you." Samuel stood and clapped a hand on Chris's shoulder. "We're just getting started. There's still a lot of work to do." Chris smiled. "I'm ready." As Chris walked out of the store that night, he felt a sense of fulfillment. The journey had been difficult, and there were still challenges ahead, but he knew he was on the right path. He had honored his uncle's legacy, not just by saving the store, but by creating a place where people felt valued and supported. The true inheritance, he realized, wasn't the stores or the profits. It was the opportunity to make a difference, to build something that mattered. And as he looked up at the sign above the door, Miller's Convenience, he knew that his uncle's legacy was in good hands. Kindness and compassion can transform lives, and sometimes by paying attention to the details, to the obstacles in the lives of those around us, we are capable of enormous gestures. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more heartfelt tales. See you in the next video.